Every political narrative starts with a story. But sometimes those stories get fucked up and made depressing by the facts that undergird them. This weekend, your host here at Varn Vlog, me, went to a convention, progressives and socialists here locally. For 2 days, we did a lot of Robert's Rule of Order, a lot of voting. You can probably figure out the organization is for, but I'm not going to go into it. And I was talking to a bright, young, progressive social democrat or democratic socialist. I don't know their nomenclature, and we'll give them whatever they want. Very sweet person. Really enjoyed talking to them. And we had fundamental differences, and I came off, my hard, like, you think popularity is leverage. You think that it does anything to get people in the door, but that's not what politics is really about. It is not about getting people in the door because you don't know how to hold them accountable when you do. And there's a game theoretic problem. The same shit I always do here at Farm Blog. You can listen to the last 7 episodes about it. Well, I talked to this individual for a while, and they wanted to, they got interested in my work and my podcast, and they weren't convinced, but they were taking it seriously. And I actually really appreciate that. And so I said, hey, there's plenty of research that says that in the United States in particular, but in most parliamentary democracies too, representatives are not particularly representative of the popular vote of their constituency at all. And that includes progressives. At least not nationally. They are somewhat responsive to very niche voters on margins if those voters are easy to get. But in general, they're not that responsive. And he asked me, well, I'd love to read research for this. And so I decided, as I'm often going to do when someone asks me a question these days, I'm going to answer it like I would a class question and tell everybody. So here's the research. So how responsive American politicians are to popular opinion is heavily researched. Modern quantitative political science, there's a lot of hard numbers on it. Over the last few decades, a robust body of peer-reviewed literature has shifted the consensus from a model of majoritarian electoral democracy where the median voter drives policy towards a model of what we might call in political science biased pluralism, aka oligarchical preference, and also the veto of capital. But I'm going to use the political science term. They don't have my highfalutin Marxist rhetoric. And economic elite domination, aka even electoral governments tend to be a representative committee of capital interest. Funny that. I wonder who could have pointed that out in the past. Anyway, so when you isolate public opinion by income or interest group alignment, the empirical evidence shows overwhelmingly that the preferences of average citizens have negligible independent impact on policy outcomes over a course of decades. Not just recently, not just during the Trump and Biden administrations, not even just during the Biden administrations. This goes back to at least the 1970s. Probably, honestly, back further than that. Ironically, and this is interesting, the more we have tried to democratize the selection of candidates, the less responsive candidates are to general popular opinion. I don't have a good theory as to why that is, except there's more points for elite capture than in the past. So maybe that is my theory. I don't really know. But I am going to talk about what 3 papers have found. It's 3 papers. It's not the end all be all, but they're pretty robust papers, and they're pretty long-term studies. So we're going to talk about these 3 papers, and you're going to decide for yourself if you think representation in our congressional democracy is at all representative of its constituents. And that's not even dealing with the number of constituents assigned to a representative, which has gotten insanely high over the past century and a half. So, probably one of the most robust studies is the Gillian and Page study from 2014. The specific paper is Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens by Martin Gillens at UCLA and Benjamin Page at Northwestern University. And it was published in Perspectives on Politics. The two authors utilized a data set of almost 1,800 policy issues between 1981 and 2002. So we're not even dealing with now, which is even less representative. They compared the policy preferences of the average citizens at least a 50th, about the 50% income percentile. So they looked at median voters and median income. Affluent citizens at the 90% income percentiles and organized interest groups with against actual legislative outcomes. Gillian Page found that when economic elites and interest groups were controlled for, the influence of the average citizen dropped statistically to near zero. It wasn't quite zero, but pretty close. Conversely, the preferences of economic elites and business-oriented interest groups, not general interest groups either, just business interest groups, has substantial independent impact on whether policy was enacted. And then, I'm just going to say this, when you look at the way courts interpret things, it gets even worse. All right. The study demonstrated that if 0% of ordinary citizens support a policy change, it has about 30% chance of passing. If the 100% of ordinary citizens support it, it still has 30% chance of passing. The probability of policy change shifts only when affluent citizens or business interests change their stance. There's also an earlier paper about wealth inequality and representation by Larry Bartels in 2008. Princeton political science Larry Bartels published a pioneering work in the book Unequal Democracy, the Political Economy of the New Gilded Age. It's funny because he had no idea how bad it was going to get. This is from 2008. Portions of which had appeared as articles in the peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Politics. Bartels examined the voting behavior of U.S. senators across the late 1980s and 1990s, mapping their roll call votes directly against survey-expressed preferences of constituents divided into low, middle, and high-income brackets. Bartels found that senators were highly responsive to the preferences of high-income constituencies. They were moderately responsive to the preferences of middle-income constituencies, but entirely unresponsive to the preferences of low-income constituencies. While Democratic senators were slightly more attentive to low-income views than Republican senators, both parties showed a massive structural bias towards the preference of wealthy donors, wealthy voters, and wealthy neighborhoods. So, back in the Biden administration, when Carl Bayer was trying to convince everyone that the Democratic Party was a party of PMC and working class urban people, without even looking at the fact that that's just not remotely true. I am here to point out that no, they're not. Never have been. And not even in their constituency, but even their constituents don't flesh out that way. The poor people who vote for the Democratic Party don't get a lot for their vote. And the poor people who vote for the Republican Party are basically pissing their vote in the wind that's blowing in their face. Splat. All right. So then there is another 20 teens papers. There are Lax, Phillips, and Bernstein. There's the Phillips and Lax paper from 2012 and the Bernstein paper from 2014. So the Lax and Phillips paper was published in the American Journal of Political Science, and they looked at the responsiveness at state level politicians across a range of salient issues: gay rights, abortion, healthcare. They found that even when public opinion is clear, policy aligns with majority opinion only about half the time. So it's not as bad as the findings at the national level by Gillian and Page, but at the state level where there's more influence, it's still pretty bad. All right. So your influence on state level politicians jumps from, from nothing essentially, if you are a median income voter, and probably less than nothing if you're a poor voter. They might even spite you, to about a coin flip of whether or not you have any effect. It's better than random, but not a lot. They found that state governors frequently pass laws that run completely counter to majority preference if the institutional structures or elite pressures favor a minority position, particularly in states that are less democratically responsive. And how you figure that out is complicated, but all 50 states don't have equal internal voting rights and whatnot, even after the 13th and 14th Amendment, which, by the way, to remind you, a few senators want that to go away. Bernstein's paper from 2014 called Democracy's Dominator talks about the disconnect between what the public wants and what Congress actually even debates. Researchers found that public opinion data set is often absent from the vast majority of bills passed. They just don't care about the public opinion on it. And when congressmen act on low salient issues, they default entirely to interest groups or committee pressures within their own party. And again, I want you to remember, this is mostly from the late 20th century. It has only gotten worse. So a few common denominators emerged from these papers. I said 3. There's really 4. Martin Gillians went and wrote a whole book on this in 2012 too. So we'll talk about that in a second. When government does occasionally pass policies that are popular with working and middle classes, public infrastructure bills, stimulus bills, tax cuts, it tends to be because it is also in line with a constituency that is more wealthy within their voting bloc. Peer-reviewed research clarifies that this is largely an artifact of coincidental alignment, not of public pressure. Popularity amongst the poor doesn't matter much. And even amongst the middle income, the power that they have diminishes the further up the chain of federalism you go. Which means making everything national politics means that people have less and less influence on it. This is not me breaking out Robert Michels. This is me talking about data done in the aught teens for the late 20th century, and we know that most surveys say that this has gotten worse. So what are reasons that Martin Gillian postures for it in his book that he wrote about this in 2012? Ordinary citizens get what they want only when their views align with the affluent. On issues of preference of the 90th income percentile diverge from the 50th income percentile, such as corporate taxation, financial regulation, social safety net funding, and trade policy, the view of the affluent runs out over time, almost 100% of the time. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the strategic implications of that are, but maybe you shouldn't be focusing on making politicians popular. Maybe you should be focusing on making the rich scared. All right. Anyway. So the academic literature points to 3 primary structural reasons for this lack of responsiveness, and we're going to go into some of the other reasons too. 1, campaign finance. Candidates rely heavily on a tiny fraction of the population, which is effectively a donor class of capital. It's not the PMC. It's people who own businesses and have high amounts of stocks and investments to fund competitive campaigns, leading to an alignment of worldview and legislative priorities with that class of people, which is a subset of the ultra wealthy. Business lobbies outspend mass public interest groups by a lot. So business lobbies have more money than labor unions and consumer advocacy groups, who often have a lot of money. It is not that they don't have a lot of money. They just don't have the kind of money that the other groups need. And while there are some advocacy groups that have high influence on local politics, such as the teachers union and the cops union, by and large, outside of large public sector unions, there's not a whole lot of influence. So they have vastly more access to congressional staffers and regulatory drafting processes, and they often just draft the fucking legislation for the Congress people anyway. Lastly, there is a constitutional design in the U.S. with filibusters, bicameralism, executive vetoes, executive orders, judicial review, which is non-responsive to public opinion anyway, that creates multiple veto points that the rich have more access to. It is exceptionally easy for a concentrated elite to block legislation favored by the public, even if it got out of Congress. And even if they cannot always pass their own legislation to get what they want. So while elections ensure that politicians cannot completely ignore the broad culturally symbolic issues, the quantitative empirical data indicates on concrete matters of political economy, material distribution, and even the text of the legislature itself. U.S. policy making functions primarily as an elite-driven system for large business interest. Now, let's talk about why this is the case even more in detail. So the number one thing is the donor class and campaign finance. Individuals who contribute significantly to political campaigns represent a tiny, unrepresented fraction of the population. They have the money to do it. They're tiny. This goes all the way back to the Federalist Papers. When people were thinking James Madison was talking about defense of the minority against the majority, they always think it's woke. But no, it's not woke. He was talking about the rich. Research shows that the donor class has distinct economic preferences favoring lower corporate taxes, relative financial deregulation, although too much deregulation and they get a little iffy, and fewer restrictions on trade compared to the median voter. Before candidates can even face an ordinary voters in a primary, they must survive the money primary to get there. Candidates who do not align with the economic outlook of wealthy donors or political action committees are often starved of resources necessary to build a campaign infrastructure, particularly at the national level. The lower levels you operate on, the more public opinion matters. That's true. But it doesn't scale up. Effectively filling out non-elite options. The Gilliam Pace study in particularly indicates that business-oriented groups have a massive independent impact on policy, one, because of the money they have, but two, their countervailing powers, mass-based organizations, particularly labor unions, which served as a vehicle to aggregate preference of working-class citizens and match the lobbying cloud of capital, have declined. Union density has declined since we've measured it. The only thing that's offset that is public sector unions, which are often easy to turn the public against because public sector unions complicate things for the public. There's also distorted voter turnout. So there's a class gap in voters too. Voter turnout in the United States is deeply stratified by income, education, and age. High-income citizens vote, volunteer, and contact representatives at significantly higher rates than lower-income citizens, period. Because lower-income citizens are less likely to show up at the ballot box, politicians facing re-election can afford to ignore them And they don't contribute to campaigns, they can afford it more than there too. So this is a self-reinforcing cycle. Where you do have public interest matters is mostly on symbolic issues, which is why all the wokeness wars was a thing, and the resentment about that is there. But it's largely a distraction because that doesn't upset the donor class all that much, one way or the other. Make of that what you will. I'll put the citations in the show notes. Protect your peace and keep fighting for a better tomorrow. And don't think at all that popularity is leverage, or even getting your people in means that they're going to do what you want.